So in terms of counseling, how do we counsel Medicare Part D enrollees? The first is we want to emphasize the importance of the low-income programs and enrollment. We want to make sure, as I've said earlier, are the LIS program and QIMB and or Medicaid, if that person qualifies, in place now. And there's a couple of different ways that you can tell. If you're able to do the personalized search for this person, and again, the vast majority of people should be able to do the personalized search through mymedicare.gov, it should indicate whether someone is receiving the full low income subsidy or not. So that's probably the best way to check. But sometimes mymedicare.gov doesn't have the most up-to-date information. Or as we said, if you're having trouble logging into the client's mymedicare.gov, there's a couple of other things you can do to check on the status of someone's low-income subsidy or QMB. You can ask them if money is coming out of their Social Security check. If that Medicare Part B premium is coming out of their check, that's an indication that there is a problem with either their Medicaid or QMB. So that can be something to follow up on with your mentor if the person does mention that they're having money withheld from their check. If someone is paying more than that maximum LIS level copay of $11.20 for a medication, if they're being charged more than that, then that could indicate a problem with their low-income subsidy or QMB. There may be some legitimate reasons that someone is paying more. Maybe it's not a Medicare-covered drug, or it could be an off-formulary drug for that drug plan. So it's not always an indication that someone is having trouble with their low-income subsidy, but it can be. So that's also a situation in which it's a good opportunity to discuss with your mentor. Even if someone's low-income subsidy or QMB are in place now, we also want to make sure that that is continuing for 2024. And we're just going to go over a little bit how deeming of the low-income subsidy status works. This is not necessarily for QMB. This deeming only really works for the low-income subsidy program. But again, as I said, in Washington, D.C., the way that the overwhelming majority of people get the low-income subsidy is through QMB. And so in terms of making sure that someone is going to get the low-income subsidy for 2024, if someone is enrolled in QMB or Medicaid in July of 2023 or later, then they are deemed to be eligible for the low-income subsidy for all of the following year. Even if they lose their QMB or Medicaid at some point in 2024, in this example, their low-income subsidy for Medicare Part D should continue for all of 2024. Likewise, if someone is enrolled in QMB or Medicaid at any time during 2024, so even before July of 2024, then they are deemed to have the low-income subsidy for at least the rest of that calendar year. So if someone is enrolled in QMB or Medicaid in, let's say, January and February, and then they lose that coverage in March, they may have to figure out what happened to their QMB or Medicaid coverage and get that fixed. But their low-income subsidy for Medicare Part D should be in place for the rest of 2024 for that calendar year. And again, you can always consult with your legal aid or your Whitman Walker mentor if you identify any problems that someone is having with their low-income subsidy with their Medicare Part D extra help. In terms of how to review Medicare Part D plan coverage for 2024, again, this first bullet point doesn't really apply because the vast majority of people are already going to have a My Medicare account. But assuming that is true, you can log in to their My Medicare account, or you can conduct the general search that we talked about if you're not able to log in. You'll review the intake form that they will have filled out or that an attorney will have filled out for them to make sure you have all of the information. You can reach out to the client or to your mentor if it's appropriate, if there's any information missing. But things that you want to make sure that you have are the low-income subsidy status. Again, that's essentially whether they have Medicaid or QMB, making sure they're actively enrolled in Medicaid or QMB. You want to have their full list of medications. And that's not just kind of the drug name, but it's the drug name, it's the dosage, it's the frequency of medications that they take. So like the absolute full name from the pill bottle, the dosage and the frequency, is it a capsule or a tablet? Some medications come in different forms. So having all of those details is very important. You'll want to know which pharmacy they are using because you will be prompted to enter their pharmacy information on mymedicare.gov. And what you want to know what their current Medicare Part D, or in some cases Medicare Advantage plan is. Again, that should pop up automatically for people in the mymedicare.gov in the personalized search of My Medicare. But for if you are in a situation where you have to do the general search, then you want to make sure that you have that information, because that will be the plan that you're comparing the others against for 2024. Will the client's plan still exist in 2024 and still be a zero premium plan? I do think one plan, and I cannot remember off the top of my head which it is, but there is one plan that was a low-income subsidy plan for 2023 that is no longer a low-income subsidy plan for 2024. I believe it's a very small copay that attaches in 2024, maybe $2 or $3. But there may be a handful of folks who are in a plan that is not going to be low-income subsidy for the next year. And as I said, is the client enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan? And we just want to make sure if they are enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan, in addition to doing the medication list analysis and making sure that that Advantage plan will cover those medications, there are a couple of other problems that people can have that pop up with Medicare Part C plans. As I said earlier, Medicare Part C plans are essentially a privatized version of Medicare Part A and B, and especially with that privatized version of Part B, sometimes there are doctors or providers who accept regular Medicare who may not accept a person's Medicare Part C coverage. So sometimes one problem that people might have, or they might bring up, if they're enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan, particularly if that enrollment happened somewhat recently, is that they may have trouble seeing the doctors that they were seeing previously. So in that situation, again, that's something you can talk to your mentor about, because there might be some additional counseling that you can offer in terms of what switching out of a Medicare Advantage plan and back into traditional Medicare and a standalone Medicare Part D plan. I think there's some additional counseling you could offer on what that means for that person. Okay, so once you have entered all of that information, either through My Medicare, the personalized search, or through the general search, once you've entered the drug information, the pharmacy, once you kind of see the list of plans that are available, what are the options for 2024? You'll want to review the plan details, starting with the plan that they are currently enrolled in for 2024. What will that plan look like for them next year? Will it cover their medications? Are there any restrictions like quantity limits or prior authorizations that have popped up that might be a problem for them? Generally speaking, obviously, if people can, for a variety of reasons, I think the strongest one is convenience. People want to stay in the same plan if they can, and they may have a bias towards staying in the same plan. I think even in situations where that plan might be a few dollars more expensive over the course of the year, if it's, $20 or $30 or $50 more expensive, sometimes it's worth avoiding the hassle of switching plans to people to just stay in the plan that they are in. But again, sometimes a medication may not be covered next year, and that might be an expensive medication. Or maybe there's some restrictions that have popped up that are going to make it kind of, really inconvenient for that person. So there are some cases in which people do want to switch plans. So the factors that you want to consider as you're looking at alternative plans for 2024, you'll want to look at the out-of-pocket costs. That's going to be the monthly premium with any co-payments. And do they perhaps have any other assistance like ADAP or other ways that they can reduce their prescription drug cost? You want to look at the drug coverage for the client's current and future drug needs. Are there any non-Medicare covered drugs? And I think we do have some. I think there's a memo that we send, and if not, we can make sure that we send it later. that that goes through some different types of medications that Medicare does not cover. But some of those might be covered by Medicaid if someone is enrolled in Medicaid, or there may be other ways that people can get assistance with non-Medicare covered drugs. You want to double check the drug restrictions, quantity limits, and prior authorizations and step therapies. The step therapy, I think, is kind of the most onerous restriction that we typically encounter. That usually requires someone to try a different medication before the medication being sought will be approved. Sometimes you can get around that with doctor's support, but sometimes you can't. So step therapies, that is definitely something to talk to your mentor about and see if there's a way around that, or if that is a reason to switch plans. When you're in, and this is something that Jess will go over, but when you're in the Medicare.gov plan finder, you can click on the plan details. That will give you all of the information that you're trying to see around drug costs and restrictions. In terms of the star rating, that doesn't usually impact most clients' perception of the plans. I think a low star rating by itself is not a reason to recommend a plan change. But if someone does need to make a plan change, there are two essentially equal options. I could see a star rating perhaps being a tiebreaker in favor of one plan versus another. But again, it's not necessarily the most important factor to consider. So after that, the next step is going to be advice and possible enrollment in a new plan. After you finish your analysis, regardless of whether the recommendation is for that person to stay or whether you're recommending a plan change, you'll always want to check with your mentor before you finish the analysis and make a final recommendation. And of course, you can also check with your mentor with questions as you go, but you always want to check with your mentor before making a final recommendation to the client about their options for 2024. You want to print and save as a PDF the plan details for their current plan, and if a different plan is being recommended for that other plan, so there's a record of why we're recommending that switch. We'll want to highlight any concerns with the low-income subsidy, Medicaid, or QMB. Medicare Advantage, again, like I said, if someone is enrolled in Medicare Advantage, making sure they're not having trouble outside of their prescription drugs, making sure they can see their doctors and all of that is usually a good question to ask. After speaking with the mentor and kind of coming to that final recommendation, you'll discuss those options with the client. Whether or not to change a plan is ultimately a client choice. We can make a recommendation, but it's up to them whether they go through with a change, even if that is what we recommend. If you're not recommending a plan change, you can let the client know, but there's nothing to do in Medicare.gov. In order to switch plans, people have to affirmatively do that enrollment. But if someone wants to stay in their plan, assuming that that plan will continue for next year, they will automatically default into that plan for 2024, so no action is needed. You can check again with your mentor on executing the client's preferred course of action, especially if that's if maybe you learned something new, if the recommendation has changed. I would go back and check with the mentor again before making that final recommendation. And like I said, it used to be the case that people could change their plan any month of the year. Now those are the even for the low income subsidy folks, the restrictions are more severe on their ability to change plans throughout the year. So it's definitely very important to check with your mentor to make sure that the recommendation that we're making is the best one. And then you'll just want to document the steps that you took. And if there's any follow-up needed, that can be done after the fact, but you'll want to document the steps that you took in a closing letter to the client. So if there are a handful of situations that come up where maybe it looks like there's not a great option for 2024, maybe their current plan is going to not cover a medication or something along those lines, like their current plan is not going to be good for them, is not going to be a good fit for 2024, but you're also having trouble finding a plan that looks very much better for 2024. If the problem is high cost, there's a few ways that you can try to troubleshoot that. Are you including an excluded drug in the search? Sometimes people will bring you their whole list. Maybe they'll ask you to enter a drug that's simply not covered by Medicare. That drug might be driving up the overall cost of someone's Medicare Part D coverage. If someone gives you a name brand drug, a lot of times they're able to take a generic alternative that will be covered if the name brand is not covered. Maybe there's a pharmacy network issue. Maybe the pharmacy that they prefer to go to is not going to be a participating pharmacy next year, which can make the costs go up. So you can counsel around that issue. If no plans cover a particular medication, if there's a medication that someone needs, but no plans cover it, then you can exclude that from the analysis to give them the best advice about the remaining drugs and talk to your mentor about how to deal with the issue of that specific drug. That might include a conversation or a recommendation that the client talk to their doctor about possible alternatives to that drug. For instance, is there a substitute? Inhalers, for example, many patients are prescribed an albuterol sulfate inhaler. Ventolin is usually what's covered by these Medicare Part D plans as opposed to ProAir. If someone puts in ProAir, that can drive up the cost a lot. So assuming that someone is able to take Ventolin, that their doctor is okay with that, that's what should be used in the Medicare search. You can also, at this point, talk to your mentor about client options. And if you really do get stuck, if it seems like there's no good option for a particular medication that someone needs, I think the best thing we can do in that situation is refer them to their doctor to see if the doctor can get involved in perhaps asking for an exception, asking for the plan to cover a drug, even though it typically doesn't, or to override some kind of a restriction on a covered drug. But again, you can talk to your legal aid or Whitman Walker mentor if you find yourself in that situation, because I think we have some additional, more specific advice about that process if it comes up. I think these are all still relevant, given that we are all still doing this mostly remote. It's a good idea to try to be as paperless as possible, saving things as a PDF instead of printing them out. Ask clients if they prefer to receive information by email or by regular mail. Some clients prefer not to receive a copy of the plan details, especially if they're not changing plans or it's going to have their personal information on it. They may not want that going through the mail. Sometimes a lot of clients now have email addresses, so you can send it to them that way, and that's a way to be paperless. In terms of getting in touch with clients, obviously clients like the rest of us may be reluctant to answer calls from numbers that are unknown to them. If the client has an email address, that can be a good way to reach out and let them know that you're calling to try to schedule a meeting. If you call someone and they do pick up, make sure to say that you're working with the Legal Aid Society or Whitman Walker, because I know that a lot of volunteers have worked with clients for several years in a row. But if you're calling someone that you haven't spoken to the first time, they may be familiar with the organization, even if they're not familiar with your specific name, if this is the first time that you're working with them. And this is just kind of general advice, but avoid storing the files on thumb drives, USB drives, removable hard drives, anything that could be easily lost or stolen. We want to try to keep clients' information as safe as possible. So I think that's basically it for the PowerPoint. We will contact those who registered with information on assignments and timelines. As I said, consultations and mentoring are going to be done remotely this year. And we'll take as much time and work as you can give us, but we are also here with as much mentoring support as you will need. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Jess. Thank you for listening.